Hi. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Schwettmann, who's going to speak about interpretability agents.
Hi, thanks. So I'm a research scientist at MIT where I work largely on automated interpretability, so scalable tools for building and understanding reliable machine learning systems. So what's the motivation here? If we rewind about 10 years ago, state-of-the-art models that we were studying looked something like Inception V1. So they were a lot smaller, still interesting model organisms to study. A couple of years later, people like Chrysola stared closely at weights between neurons inside these models and could start to piece together algorithms underlying circuits that showed us something about how a model like Inception V1 could detect cars. Maybe in an earlier layer, you see neurons that are selective for individual windows, maybe the body of the car and wheels, and downstream they converge on something that looks like a car detector, right? That assembles these pieces into something more meaningful. And by staring at the weights of these models and feature visualizations of inputs that activated these units, we could start to understand something about the algorithms underlying how this model made decisions. This was done largely by hand, right? By a team of scientists staring at this model on its own. Fast forward 10 years, we have models that are a lot more complicated, like GPT-4o or O1, where you can ask them to perform a pretty difficult task, like write code to program a game of Space Invaders, but add physics, maybe including vertical gravity, and these models can do this. And it's too complicated to understand kind of billion parameter models like this by hand. So where do we go if we want to apply these same kinds of model understanding techniques that humans could use to infer algorithms underlying small models to billion parameter models like the ones that we're interacting with today? So a team of us at MIT has started to use AI systems themselves to take advantage of kind of the scale of the data and the complexity of these problems to apply automated techniques or AI-backed techniques to help us understand AI systems. And we've been asking whether we can automate kind of the process of scientific experimentation that human scientists use to understand these models. So we consider this question of automated interpretability. Say you're classifying this image, you detect a suit in the image, and we kind of want to understand how a model is making this decision. We can ask what individual neurons inside this image classifier are doing, and maybe here's one in layer 4 of ResNet, and if we look at where in the image this neuron was active and its activation value, I can kind of see that, oh, this neuron activated over maybe the person's chin, right? That only characterizes this unit's behavior on a single image. I can also do something like pass all of ImageNet through this model and record the images and image regions where this unit was maximally active. I can look at these things and say, what do they all have in common? Maybe they all have to do with people's chins or neckwear or suits. And in fact, we can ask human annotators the same question. And humans say this sort of thing. Maybe the images that maximally activate this unit all have to do with chins or things that tie together or bow ties and cameras. We're not really sure, but they do seem to have something like this in common. And in fact, a couple of years ago, in a first automated interpretability approach, we trained a model to maximize pointwise mutual information between descriptions like those written by humans and image regions, so that this learned model could actually automatically produce descriptions that look kind of like what humans would write about image regions that maximally activate neurons inside different architectures. And how did we do this? Well, we had to train this model, which we called Milan, on a whole bunch of human descriptions of real image regions that activate these neurons. And so we also just introduced a data set called annotations with like 60,000 of these neuron descriptions written by real human subjects. And when you trained the Milan system on these human annotations, it could then produce these kinds of relatively reasonable descriptions. For instance, of this neuron, said, oh, human and animal faces and body parts. It looks okay. But when I look at this now, it feels more like a first hypothesis about what this neuron is doing. It does seem like all of those image regions have those things in common. But if I really wanted to understand what this neuron was doing, I would want to perform some additional experiments. So what if we pose this model understanding problem from the level of individual units to larger scale model behaviors as something like automated hypothesis testing, where we build understanding through a 4-part experimental loop. starting by observing initial data, so like looking at all of those images that maximally activated that unit and asking what they had in common. And we can write those things down as hypotheses. In a simple version, as natural language, maybe we can do something a little more formal. And then the next thing we would do is generate experimental data to evaluate each of those hypotheses. And maybe those hypotheses would make different predictions about that data. And then we can evaluate those hypotheses by picking the one that best predicts the experimental data observed and then refining the hypotheses to better capture what we see in our experiments. And we can kind of continue through this loop until some desired standard of evidence is reached. And as language models are getting better and better, and as AI systems are able to operate over lots of different types of inputs and even multimodal inputs, we can use these kinds of foundation models to actually automate each step of this experimental loop and do something a little more flexible and generalizable than what we saw with Milan a moment ago, where a single model was trained on representative human data to perform a particular interpretability task. What if we could build a system that was more flexible and acted as kind of an automated interpretability scientist that replaced the human in this loop that usually performs each of these steps with an agent that can make hypotheses on its own, design experiments, and evaluate how well its hypotheses match observed data? And this is the type of paradigm that would really allow us to scale interpretability from something that's ad hoc, where questions have to be asked of individual systems for individual tasks, to a more generalizable approach that can scale alongside the models that we're trying to interpret. And imagine we had an interpretability agent that functioned like this. We could ask it a question that we were asking a moment ago of the Milan system and say, oh, what's feature 122 in layer 4 of our model selective for? And maybe this ideal interpretability agent would go off and write some code or call a tool or perform some magic and compute exemplars from the ImageNet data set that maximally activate this neuron. It would return them. It would take a look at them and their activation values, and then make some hypotheses about what the unit might be doing. There are multiple different explanations for what we could be seeing. Maybe the unit's selective for bow ties. There's some kind of neckwear in all of those pictures, or maybe it's just chins and faces and it's chance that there's neckwear in all of these images. So then the agent might design a follow-up experiment to specifically test each of these hypotheses. So we could generate a person's face, pass that through the model, and return the neuron's activation value. Not very active. None of the regions are highlighted. But then to test one of its hypotheses, it could perform an edit on the image. This is different from any of the techniques that we've seen before that perform this kind of one-shot description, like Milan or other automated interpretability techniques that label features or neurons inside language models. What if we can causally intervene on input space to kind of tease apart differences for what might activate this unit, right? So let's edit this image and add a bow tie. There's already a chin in there, but when we add a bow tie to the image, all of a sudden, the neuron becomes active. And after a couple more experiments like this, the agent could conclude that, okay, this feature is selective for bow ties, in fact, and it helps that they're in the context of formal attire. But I was able to kind of causally probe this hypothesis and reach this conclusion and return it to you, the human user. And in fact, there's a ton of tools like this that we can equip a language model-backed agent with to be able to design increasingly complex experiments to answer human queries or to act as kind of co-experimentalists alongside human scientists. And those tools emerged 10 years ago in our study of convolutional neural nets, have advanced to tools for understanding circuits in language models or training sparse autoencoders on language model activations to maybe produce more interpretable features. The difficulty as a human scientist in interacting with all of these tools is that it's sometimes hard to know which exactly to apply to the question at hand. And there's a diverse array of questions we can answer about models of interest, and you really want to be able to apply different tools, see the result, and iterate, and maybe try something different. We are introducing automated interpretability agents that can kind of do just that, or prototype systems built from language models equipped with tools like those that interpretability researchers use, that can then use those tools to design experiments to answer interpretability questions about a model of interest. And these agents are given access to an API of interpretability tools in their system prompt. And then the prompt from the user specifies the task that they're supposed to apply those tools to answer. And then the agent itself comes up with ways to compose those tools to design experiments by writing code that answers the user's query. So a human user could interact with a system like this by asking a pretty open-ended question, like what features of a user query to the language model might increase the probability that the model will hallucinate? And the interpretability agent could start by examining natural input-output pairs using real-world data to make hypotheses, and then synthesizing kind of controlled experimental data, like I said, to differentially test these hypotheses, run the model forward, and complete this loop until it can converge on a hypothesis that best explains model output. And as new tools become available that increase the complexity of the types of interpretability experiments we can do, we can equip agents with these tools simply by adding them to the API that the agent has access to while designing these experiments. So let's see a couple more examples. Here, similar neuron description task, human asks what visual concepts this neuron is selective for, and Maya, a multimodal automated interpretability agent, writes code to design experiments to answer this question. And it begins by running something like network dissection or passing a large data set of real-world images through the model, and then returning those that maximally activate the neuron of interest, their activation values, and the regions inside the image that drive that activity. And then based on that experimental output, Maya autonomously makes some initial hypotheses, interacts with the user, and says that based on the activations observed and the images provided, high activations appear to be associated with images that involve spherical objects and hands. Well, this is a pretty simple one. But let's still perform some image editing experiments to test this hypothesis about spherical objects and hands. So Maya writes more code to design a new experiment and runs a text-to-image tool, in our case Stable Diffusion 2, to synthesize new test images corresponding to prompts that the agent itself writes to test its own hypotheses. So what if we synthesize images of a person holding a cube and a person holding a banana? And if the system is only selected for hands holding spherical objects, then these new images shouldn't activate the neuron, which is in fact what we see. If these hypotheses are correct, then we should be able to edit these images to replace the non-spherical objects with some kinds of balls, and then the neuron should be active if it's in fact sensitive to hands interacting with spherical things. So Maya makes these images by calling an image editing tool. In our case, on the back end, it's instruct pix to pix, changes the cube to a ball, and pardon the bad hand, but Maya notices that automatically this neuron lights up when the cube is changed to a ball, and the same thing with the bananas, which get turned into kind of curious banana balls that the neuron prefers over the non-spherical bananas. So based on these experimental results and a few more that have been omitted for time, Maya concludes that the neuron's highest activations are indeed linked, after verifying these hypotheses, to round objects being held, and produces this label, neuron selective for hands interacting with spherical objects. User says, thank you. Maya says, you're welcome. If you have any more questions or need further assistance, feel free to ask. But how do we know this label is actually correct? When we're interpreting models in the wild, we have the long-standing issue that we actually don't know the ground truth about what model components are doing. The gold standard is what humans might say after observing, but even we need to perform additional experiments and can only kind of make a best guess and don't have access to ground truth knowledge about what model components do for verifying interpretability methods like Maya. But actually, what I showed you just now was not a real neuron inside a visual system. It was actually a synthetic neuron built by hand, by us, from grounded SAM with text guidance telling that synthetic neuron what to respond to in image input. So I supply text guidance drawn from this malannotations data set of real human annotations of real neurons inside vision architectures and say, you should select for balls and hands to create kind of a more complex conditional neuron, spherical objects only when hands are present. And then this grounded SAM-based detector behaves like a real vision neuron and returns output in the format that looks like our neuron output that Maya is used to seeing. So we can evaluate how well our system produces natural language descriptions of known detectors because they're built by hand from behaviors that real neurons display. Right? So in parallel, our group at MIT has an effort of building these kinds of synthetic test systems for automatically evaluating interpretability procedures across modalities. So we've built a benchmark data set called FIND that's made up of a bunch of different functions, numerical functions, language functions, and now including this set of synthetic vision neurons that all kind of follow this principle of building systems with known ground truth that resemble behaviors found in the wild that we can then use to evaluate interpretability procedures. So we have a pretty big data set of these synthetic neurons that vary in complexity from simple monosemantic neurons that respond to single concepts to polysemantic synthetic neurons that respond to either one concept or another, and then kind of the more complicated conditional neurons that I showed you an example of, balls, but only when hands are present. And we can compute these data set exemplars of these neurons using a large real-world image data set like ImageNet or CC3M. And you can see some examples of the kinds of behaviors our synthetic neurons display, like what Maya sees. And they detect bridges, sunglasses, polysemantic neuron detecting fire or fur, or beaches only when people are present. Maya can produce descriptions of these neurons, and then we can evaluate them directly, right? Since we know the ground truth. Imagine we had a tail neuron, and we can evaluate two different interpretability procedures trying to describe what this neuron does, maybe Maya and then our previous method, Milan, and they produce labels like fluffy and textured animal tails. Or another method might say circular objects and animals, and we can ask human judges which of these labels better matches the ground truth label of the neuron. Humans perform this task. We can compare many different interpretability methods using this same task, and we find that Maya even outperforms human descriptions of the same neurons, which is pretty cool, suggesting that these kinds of automated interpretability systems kind of match human performance on some of these tasks now. We find similar behaviors on real units. This isn't unique to synthetic neurons. Might look at neuron 593 in layer 4 of ResNet, and Maya again designs experiments, sees a neuron that looks pretty selective for balls, makes a couple of different hypotheses. Maybe it's different features of the balls that are driving activity, can write prompts to generate images that capture different dimensions of tennis ballness. Maybe the roundness, the fuzzy texture, or the color yellow could be driving activity, not the tennis ball itself. Can run tests on all of these and confirm that, in fact, it does need to be a tennis ball. But how sensitive is this neuron to tennis balls across different environments? Maybe we can vary the background that the tennis ball is on and sees that, oh, activity seems to be high, independent of the domain in which the tennis ball appears. So Maya will conclude with the description of, okay, the neuron is selected for the presence of tennis balls regardless of where they're found. It performs tennis ball recognition. In fact, if we give humans the same API of interpretability tools that I showed you we gave to Maya, so the ability to write code to call ImageNet and compute images that maximally activate the neuron or edit those images, what do humans do when given the same neuron that we saw Maya evaluate on the previous slide? Well, humans start, I didn't show it here, humans start by also calling dataset exemplars and then try and perform more tests. They do things that are pretty similar to what Maya does. First, they test for color by writing prompts to images that are yellow, greenish yellow, or green. Then they test tennis balls. And then they test whether maybe other types of balls also activate the neuron. So you see similar behaviors in human labelers who conclude also that this is a tennis ball neuron. And now that we have human labels as well as automated labels of units across a variety of vision architectures, we can evaluate these descriptions of neurons in the wild. Now we don't have ground truth, so we have to do something a little different and ask how well descriptions produced by these automated methods kind of predict neuron behavior on new data, right? A good description should allow you to characterize what kinds of inputs will activate that neuron and what kinds of inputs won't, right? So we can perform tests like this and compile descriptions produced by different interpretability methods into a larger list and ask a language model to take this list and decide prompts for descriptions produced by each interpretability method, kind of which images should activate the neuron and which should not, should cause no deviation in activity from a neutral baseline. And if a label is good, then a language model judge should be able to pair it with images that do cause a large activation, right? And we can iterate over labels produced by different interpretability methods and evaluate how well these labels allow us to predict how images produced from those prompts will activate the neuron. And we can compare interpretations produced by different interpretability procedures using these kinds of tests. And we find here again that Maya outperforms our previous method, Milan, across all the models we looked at. So we looked at ResNet, Vision Transformer, we looked at Dino and CLIP, and the synthetic neurons I showed you earlier. And Maya is often on par with human experts. If you look at kind of the teal cross and the lime green cross, we find that the amount by which images predicted to positively activate the neurons vary from the neutral baseline are pretty similar between the human labels produced in the way I showed you before and labels produced by our Maya system. Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a basic question, right? I guess like not all neurons are interpretable, right? Or like, can you select the ones that are, or like, what does this thing produce when the neurons just like, I guess, doesn't do anything?
Yeah, great question. We don't select the ones that are here. For some of the kind of example experiments I've shown you, I've selected ones that are interpretable, so the experiments make sense. But for maybe about like 40% of these, 30 to 40% of neurons, it's tough for even human labelers to make sense of what they're doing, right? Humans in Maya are relatively on par with those, but often the system will just say, it's hard to draw any conclusions from the data presented.
It just tells you I don't know, or it makes up something that was.
It often doesn't make things up. It'll say, I don't know, because the kinds of data that you see there, I have some example slides, if you know, some extra slides I can show you later. The kinds of data you see there is just difficult to make sense of. You see kind of a bunch of scattered behavior. Maybe it's extremely polysemantic. And Maya might say it's tough to find a concept that unifies all of these pieces of data. Another thing that happens sometimes is that the Maya system itself kind of fails to generate experimental data that can adequately test its hypotheses. So you see some examples of tool failures here. I don't know if you can see the prompts, the resolution of the screen in person. But sometimes, like Stable Diffusion fails to correctly generate images from prompts, so it's hard to even get signal from the system we're measuring. And a couple of examples on the bottom of the text-to-image tools, instructing it to produce a picture of a foggy night with no visible yellow tones. And of course, it creates a foggy night with yellow lights. It has a hard time following negative instructions. And so you can kind of prompt engineer this a little bit and try and get Stable Diffusion to produce something, or tell the agent not to write negative prompts and only say, you know, the content that you do want included. It still fails sometimes. A smartphone with buttons laying on a table, a hand is holding the smartphone. Image editing is also a little bit unreliable. There are a couple examples here of image edits that try and replace the chimpanzee's tool in the first row with a leaf, and it replaces the entire scene with leaves, so kind of low spatial controllability. Replace the poodle with a teddy bear. Well, it kind of changes the texture and color of the poodle a little bit to look more like a teddy bear, but it's still just a brown dog. There are some ablation studies in the 2024 SCML paper that look at what happens if we replace Stable Diffusion with kind of better generators like Dolly. And you can see that the Maya system improves as kind of the quality of its tools improves, which suggests, again, that this betting on scale and model improvement is the right bet to make, and our ability to kind of make interpretations will get better as both our tools and our reasoning backbones improve. Yeah.
How does the tool know? How does the agent know that its tool has failed?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of ways. Ideally, a good experimenter would look, right? It would look at the edit that it wrote, look at the image output, because it can see all of that. It's just added to the context that the agent has access to as it's performing its experimental loop. It would see all of that and say, oh, I told it to replace just the chimpanzee's tool with a leaf, and now I have a picture of leaves. That failed, experiment didn't work, let me do the experiment again. That like never happens. It was really interesting, actually, as we were designing this system, some of the same confirmation bias that we see in kind of the worst human science also shows up in systems like these. So it really is a scientist in all possible senses. Like it thinks it's testing for this thing and, oh, replaces a chimpanzee's tool with a leaf, you know, now it's not active. Therefore, my hypothesis was correct. It's very quick to conclude these things. So the question for us as system designers is like, how do you design that out of a system and teach it to be a good scientist? I don't think we got all the way there with this system. One thing you can do is add additional kind of unbiased agents to come in and describe the results of these kinds of basic image editing experiments and translate images back to text and tell the backbone agent kind of what's going on. So Maya has access to a couple of tools like this that do image to text that it can call. We don't force it. But it has the option to call tools like this to summarize outputs of experiments in an unbiased way. So it would just summarize both of these images on the top row, and it'd be like an image of a chimpanzee holding a knife and a banana or something, and an image of leaves. And then sometimes from that, it's able to conclude that, oh, the editing went awry, let me try again. I think ultimately you might also want kind of multi-agent pipelines that are able to do experiments in parallel or show results of one experiment and an interim conclusion drawn to another agent judge. And something like a debate format or a multi-agent pipeline would also be pretty successful. I saw another hand up over here. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry. This is super cool. Are any of the tools able to interact with the weights of the image generating model if you want to increase a weight to test like what it signifies?
Not yet in Maya. No, but that's a great idea, right? Ideally, if you have white box access to systems, you don't only want to be able to probe activations of model components. You also want to be able to edit weights themselves or compute a circuit, intervene on a circuit, do some kind of patching experiment. These are things we're working on now, but this implementation of Maya does not have the ability to edit model weights. There's one more question in the back. Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that the assumption here is that like a neuron that's activated more, that means that it's more responsible for representing something in the image. I'm wondering whether there's other hypotheses, right, that you think of the pattern of neuron activations as a vector, not as where the scale of the activation matters as much as more of the actual value. So I'm wondering that to what extent does Maya have that underlying hypothesis that the more active a neuron is, it means it's more responsible for something.
We tell it that that matters. And you can also give it kind of numerical feedback that maybe activations of images produced doesn't reach some threshold. And that threshold could be something like mean activation over top percentile of maximally activating images from a real world data set. So we could say, oh, that when you ran network dissection, returned 15 maximally activating images, the mean of those was like 15.2. So when you test new synthetic images, for the neuron to really be active, it needs to be comparable to the activity observed on these real world images. We've tried an implementation like that. It helps Maya not early stop. So I think like intrinsically, the agent doesn't quite understand that this kind of magnitude also matters. It's not an all or none event. There could be lots of reasons for that. It's kind of difficult for agents to keep track of sequences in context, of numerical sequences. Just this is backbone GPT-4o, right? So unless you give it maybe some more structured way to analyze this data, just telling it, oh, you need to look at new activations and compare them to activation values you've seen in the past, it's still prone to this kind of like quickness to stop and overfitting that we see in some of the confirmation bias style experiments. So it doesn't get that a priori. We can give it tools that allow it to compare activation values to previous activation values and kind of build into the system something about the fact that this matters based on what we know about models. Yeah. Then I'm going to move on. One more.
Can you deal with something like subroutines? Can it somehow affect something more than a single activation?
Yeah, so it doesn't have any tools to do any sort of like disentanglement of vectors themselves, or like find a calculate a subspace where principal components of this subspace represent like different things that the neuron is selected for. We could give it tools like that. Tools like that exist. What it can see is just that kind of polysemantic activity as captured in exemplars that maximally activate the unit. And there were some examples of those in the synthetic neurons, right? So we built synthetic systems that respond to logical compositions of concepts. I'm going to hate myself for jumping back so far in just a second. But this fire or fur example, you see here, just like captured in input patterns that maximally activate the neuron. Oh, there's some concepts representing fire, some concepts representing fur, and the neuron should respond kind of equally to both of those, right? Our synthetic neurons didn't capture composition like any more than two concepts, but you definitely see that in neurons in the wild. Our evaluation scheme kind of implicitly gets to that. It does require all of those concepts that it could possibly be selected for to be kind of captured in the pool of possible prompts that's used to generate images. So it's a little bit insensitive to things that no other kind of method picked up. But short answer is we capture that in inputs that activate the neuron. There are more complex tools for kind of analyzing those different dimensions of selectivity that like could be incorporated into later versions of the system. One more. Yeah, Amy.
To have this automated way of identifying polysemanticity, did you see any patterns in what kinds of concepts or objects tend to be conflated in terms of like more or less co-occurrence in text, stuff like that?
No, we haven't done that kind of study like closely here. I think my answer offhand would be things that seem to co-occur more in like the natural world. That's what I would guess. But when I think through about examples we've actually seen, it doesn't always happen like that. Like sometimes like cats and cars will co-occur a lot or things like this. It also kind of depends on the architecture you're analyzing and what the training objective was. So in models like CLIP, sometimes you see sensitivity to kind of like word games or something like this. That's a common form of something that looks like polysemanticity off the cuff, but then you actually realize they're probably closely related in an input data set. So where it makes sense to humans, my guess right now is that it's kind of co-occurrence in real world training data and depends on the training objective. But a lot of them kind of like don't make a ton of sense right now. So I need other tools for disentangling them. I'm going to talk a little bit more and then come back to questions in a few slides. There are a couple of applications of tools like this that might also steer the conversation a bit. So where does that leave us? Looking at kind of interpretability agents built from language models or vision language model backbones that can automate this kind of hypothesis testing loop that underlies a lot of different model understanding tasks. And Maya that we've looked at is a prototype system that produces arguably almost human-level descriptions of model components. And the modular design of agents like these makes it pretty straightforward to incorporate new tools and to adapt the system to different types of downstream tasks. We've looked at a lot of neuron description tasks right now, but there are a lot of other kind of behaviorally relevant and safety relevant tasks that you might want to apply an automated agent to help with. For instance, like spurious features are a pretty common problem, spurious associations between inputs and outputs, and it's quite labor intensive for humans to inspect models and start to understand which learned features inside a model are actually spurious and don't capture what we want the model to know. And as models get bigger and bigger, it's quite painstaking for humans to perform these kinds of analyses. So what if this is the kind of thing that an agent like Maya could automate? To test stuff like this, we can train toy systems that capture learned spurious associations, but they also show up quite a bit in real-world models. And we can train a small model, for instance, on this data set called spurious, which is just a little more complicated than something like water birds, where in the train set, dogs are spuriously correlated with different kinds of backgrounds. So corgis will only show up in the snow, dachshunds will only show up in the jungle, and so on. And then we can test the system on randomized pairs where dogs can show up on any different image background. And systems has like 73% test accuracy on these balanced test sets when they're trained on the unbalanced train set. So we can ask Maya, there's a lot of text on this slide, but we can ask Maya to go through and look at last layer neurons inside this model and try and detect which features are sensitive to spurious correlations between dog and background, and find the features that are robust, that detect dogs invariantly of background. And so you can imagine the types of experiments that a system might do to test this. Just one example on the right, I didn't show too much, where Maya could generate dogs on different kinds of backgrounds and see if a neuron sensitive to corgis shows the same magnitude of activation regardless of the background on which the corgi is placed. And then the agent could conclude, okay, this feature is robust. It is not spuriously correlated between the dog and the background. So if I want to do something like train an unregularized linear regression model on just the set of features that's robust, then that should improve model performance. And in fact, that's what we see on the bottom left here. Will this laser work? No. If you look on the bottom left, we compare what happens if you train an unregularized linear regression model on just the features selected by Maya to be robust to dog and background correlation. And we find like 10% improvement over base model performance on the unbalanced test set. And it even does better than using linear regression, like regularized linear regression, to pick the set of neurons that you want to look at. So an agent could help with these kinds of tasks that rely on kind of this finicky experimentation and testing of correlation between kind of foreground and background that would be labor intensive for a human to do, but Maya is able to do it and improve performance on tasks like this. Another kind of relevant task is auditing models for biases. So this is a simple one, but when we're looking at lots of different types of biases across like all of ImageNet, for example, again, it would take a long time for a human to go through and say, oh, this ImageNet category is supposed to be selective for green shirts, or for shirts, but in fact, it's only selective for green shirts and assigns lower probability to other types of shirts as being shirts. So what if we could ask our agent to do this for us? And Maya goes through and examines output neurons in ResNet 152 trained to classify ImageNet and finds kind of previously unknown biases in ImageNet. For example, that inside the Labrador Retriever class, this ResNet prefers yellow labs over chocolate labs. And it's able to do this by looking at real data set exemplars, but also synthesizing new test images to test these kinds of hypotheses. In the beer glass category, it finds that males holding beer glasses are far more preferred by the model over females holding the same kinds of beer glasses, which is pretty interesting, like huge drop in classification accuracy on some of the images of women on the right. And in yet other examples, Maya doesn't find any bias. For instance, in this flagpole category, it finds that flags across a wide variety of settings are equally likely to be classified as flags. So a pirate flag, a pride flag, all show up as high likelihood of being flags. And kind of one fun example, we can look in more detail in an experiment where Maya tries to find biases in the first ImageNet category, so tench fish. It does this again by calling real data set exemplars, seeing what they have in common, making some hypotheses. The system seems to be biased toward images of tench being held by people. Maybe you need fishing equipment in the loop. It writes code to generate new test images to evaluate these hypotheses. It sees that, oh, images of people holding the fish are a lot more likely to be classified as fish than images of fish in the water by themselves or even prepared as sushi. Continuing from the findings, Maya proposes another final experiment and tests this fish in kind of crazy settings in space, in a city, in a futuristic city, and concludes that actually the system is most receptive to fish being held by males in natural environments and not fish on their own and not fish in these kinds of futuristic settings, which is a bit funny. And it turns out that this tench fish, this first ImageNet category, is actually native to Austria. And we presented this work at ICML over the summer. So I thought it's probably a good idea to go and try and find tench fish in the wild and see if I can take some pictures with them and contribute to online data stores of images of people holding tench and reduce this gender bias a little bit. Turns out that tench are really elusive and hard to catch. But I did catch a barbel in the Danube River, and this is now in Wikimedia Commons. There's a couple of versions of it, of a woman holding a fish in the wild. So counteracting a little bit of bias uncovered by Maya on data sets in the wild. You can see a lot more experiments like this on the online Maya browser that we've built. There's like a short link here, but also it's accessible if you just Google me and Maya. There's a project page where you can step through full experiments that Maya has conducted on individual neurons across a variety of architectures, and then also some of these kind of downstream model auditing tasks like the spurious feature removal and the bias discovery. It's pretty cool to look at more examples of what you've seen here. So again, where does this leave us? We've kind of looked at interpretability agents relevant for these model understanding tasks and model auditing tasks. But I think it's important as we build towards scalable insight into systems using tools like these to ask actually what we want to understand, right, about the systems that we're analyzing. Now, first pass at that is a couple of things. I think as interpretability scientists, we want to understand internal computations of models. So what do models compute and what information is localized to particular hidden representations? We saw some examples of describing that in natural language today. And importantly, how is it computed? What upstream information is relevant to downstream feature detection, right? And then we want to use that internal computation information to understand something about model behavior, ideally, right? This kind of closes the loop between bottom-up and top-down understanding. If we can link behavior to what we know at a fine-grained level and answer questions like, are there inputs for which a model behaves incorrectly or problematically, right? Are there safety-relevant use cases of automatic behavior generation? And can we actively generate these inputs and predict instances where a model might fail? And my claim is that we can use agents in the loop to automate a large part of this feedback between understanding internal computations and then using those to understand and predict things about model behavior. And sort of as a teaser, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I'm actually co-founding a new org with Jacob Steinhardt from here that builds scalable tools for model understanding tasks and wants to take this AI-backed approach to understand all parts of the ML pipeline and steer frontier AI development in the public interest. We're a nonprofit new research org, not publicly announced yet, but soon. You can write us if you want to learn more. And thanks. I think more time for questions now.
So you've described this like very nice like iterative procedure where you have hypotheses that get augmented or like refined in some sense. Is there a nice way of knowing when the model should stop attempting to modify its hypotheses?
Yes. Right. Ideally, you want to give that information like in a quantifiable way. You don't want the model to have to just, oh, I've done enough experiments, right? A very simple version of that is some thresholding for some standard of evidence, like when you can synthetically generate an image that produces activation in the neuron that matches activation on real world examples, and you like understand the neuron well enough to write a language description of it that's actually predictive of its activity. So that's a simple version of it, but I think ultimately you do want like quantified feedback to agents, and they could also learn to receive that feedback. But that's where you want these kinds of things to go. We have time for maybe like one more question. If there are any. Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm understanding correctly, you're trying to use the power of large models to understand small models, right? So,
Not necessarily small. Large models to understand other models.
yeah, my question is like, what do you think will be different if you're trying to like use large models to understand larger models?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there are kind of like other approaches to this. I don't think much of the Maya technique like fundamentally changes so long as you can instrument the model and have access to its internal computations. There could be tricky things like if the larger model can intentionally obfuscate its response and the smaller model is only analyzing the larger one at the level of input-output relations, right? The smaller model might need to be instructed to pay particular attention to something in the hiddens that would give you information about some strange behavior that the larger model is displaying. So the human scientist might need to do that. But I think like inherently, the kind of broadest strokes characterization of this approach where you're using kind of an AI-backed technique to learn a model or instruct a model to make sense of like some other system also scales to small model interpreting large, but there might be kind of behavioral quirks or other settings we need to care about where human oversight is important to tell a smaller model like what to look for. To stay on schedule, I'm going to wrap here, but I will be around during coffee if people want to chat more.